quick mention about some issues around altitude sickness. As I said, the book did cut down the material on altitude sickness for this edition. I'm not quite sure why, but for me, I feel like because of where we live, that it's important to recognize how serious this can be and also to understand what maybe some of the symptoms might be that you need to look out for. So, because of some of the symptoms, often it gets shrugged off, or your mates might laugh at you, but it is very serious and can often require medical attention. It can become an emergency, and there's some literature that suggests that women are more susceptible than men. I haven't had that experience personally. Seems to me like my partner and I both have issues sometimes. And so there's 3 different levels of altitude sickness. The first one, acute mountain sickness or acute altitude sickness. Generally, I mean, if you took your athletes today from Portalis to Cloudcroft to go training for the weekend, they might exhibit some of these symptoms. But you see it a lot in recreational athletes who are out at quite high altitudes, right, 8 to 11,500 feet. So if you go to Ruidoso for the weekend, you can have some of these issues, particularly, as I said, if you go up quickly, which we would do, just for the weekend. So the symptoms can last if you go up and you stay up, right? So if you're going on a skiing holiday and you're not just going for the weekend, symptoms can last for up to a week. And they include headaches, some nausea, some weakness. Remember that we've got large reduction in partial pressure of oxygen, and so oxygen transport into the muscle tissue is quite poor the higher we go, and so we feel a little bit weak, shortness of breath, of course, because you can't get the oxygen that you need. Difficulty sleeping, and I have to say, when we go to our RV is at about 6,000 feet, and I always have trouble the first night or 2 when we go sleeping. So I don't know, it's technically not high enough to really be this, but yeah, I find my sleep pattern really goes up the wazoo. And some athletes will, or some individuals will experience loss of appetite. Never had that problem. Never had that problem. So that one's interesting if you are going to take your athletes to altitude for a training camp, for example. You need to keep an eye out because obviously if they're not eating enough, they're not going to benefit from the additional training and they won't be able to train at their optimum level. Okay, but this one wears off pretty quick. Not everybody gets it, right? But it is worth just keeping an eye out for. Level 2 is pretty serious. So level 2 can be life-threatening, and it's high-altitude pulmonary edema. So here we're looking at fluid on the lungs. All right. So again, headaches. You might see vomiting, and it's pretty serious. Takes a while to recover from. You need to get down in altitude as quickly as possible. and get medical attention. Okay? Now, the third level, and here's where you have some issues, because if you don't deal with level 2 quickly enough, or you ignore level 2, right, and you get to level 3, now you're going to basically need airlifting off the mountain, okay? So now we've got accumulation of fluid in the cranial space between your brain and your skull, right? And so all that fluid is pushing on the brain. You're going to get disorientation, you may get seizures, you may get coma, and that requires immediate medical attention. So you've got to typically probably call in for a helicopter to come and get you at this point, or your friends will be, because you won't be able to call anybody, right? So for all of them, the treatment is rest, come down the mountain, all right? But as I said, this cerebral edema, that's really serious, right? Because you can drop into a coma and just never wake up with that one. And if you do come up, the damage to the brain tissue might be such that there are some ongoing issues that you have to deal with, all right? So the suggestions, how do we reduce susceptibility, right? Because I want to go skiing for the weekend and I don't want to have to deal with even level 1 of this. So the first one, I think, makes sense, but it's not very realistic in my book. Go up gradually, no more than just under 1,000 feet a day. The second one makes more sense. So you have to limit your initial exertion, right? So that means that if you're going backpacking for the week and you're going to be up at altitude, day 1 isn't the day you do 15 miles, right? Day 1 is I'm going to take it slow, we're just going to go 5 or 6 miles, set up camp, right? Chill out, okay? Dehydration, we already talked about the fact that the higher you are, the cooler the air is, the drier the air is, and therefore dehydration. If you're sweating, that sweat is going to evaporate much more quickly, and you also lose vapor from your trachea and esophagus, right? So dehydration can occur very quickly as well, and so your hydration behavior is vital. And then there's this drug which apparently can help to prevent the side effects of altitude, acetazolamine. But I'd never heard of it before I read about it in the book, so I've not tried it. I'm lucky. The lack of sleep is really the only one of those symptoms I ever suffer, right? So loss of appetite never happens. Headaches, I don't really remember getting headaches regularly, right? Generally, the headache is due to the fact that I haven't drunk enough water, okay? All right, so what kinds of adaptations are we going to expect then if we're able to spend enough time at altitude to acclimatize? All right, so in the short term, right, so a month to a month and a half, you'll see increases in pulmonary ventilation. Remember we said that you're going to breathe a little more deeply, particularly when you're exercising. We start to see, after 3 to 4 weeks, we start to see increased release of erythropoietin, and that stimulates red blood cell production. And if I've got more red blood cells, then I've got more hemoglobin, and also we see an increase in plasma volume. So within like a month and a half, your body's doing everything it can to make it easier to move that oxygen around the body and transport it to the muscles. In the long term, right, so if you are able to stay at altitude for 12 weeks or more, then you'll start to see changes in the muscle tissue itself. So much more mitochondria, the capillary network around the muscle tissue gets more dense. More mitochondria, of course, remember what I said before, adaptations are typically positive, right? Why would I need more mitochondria? Because that's where aerobic metabolism occurs, okay? So if I've got more mitochondria, even though I've got less oxygen able to transport in, I can use that oxygen to the best of my capability, right? The enzymes in oxidative phosphorylation increase, and cardiac output goes up, partly because we've got an increase in plasma volume. So remember I said on, what day is it today? Friday, Wednesday, I mentioned we want to try to live high, train low, right? To the best of our ability. That's what the research would suggest. You know, live as high as you can, but get somewhere where you can train at a good intensity and you can keep your volumes up and not have to decrease training because you're at altitude, right? It doesn't matter how long you live at altitude, how much training you do or don't do at altitude, your VO2 max is never going to be as high as it would be at sea level, right? Because VO2 max is dependent upon oxygen saturation, okay? And you can't get 100% oxygen saturation at altitude. So, some of the practical issues, if I'm at 14,000 feet, right, I could spend 7 days at 14,000 feet, lots of rest, little bit of training, and then come back down without developing too many of the side effects of being up there. Individuals who live at moderate altitudes, so we're just under what they would really call moderate, but we've still got a benefit from being at 4,000 feet. But if you're at 5, 6, 7,000 feet, then you're going to have a much better ability to compete at altitude than people that are lower than 5,000 feet. And so what some teams that have lots of money, mind you, right, is what you have to think about. So teams will arrive up to 24 hours before the competition, right, and let some adaptation start to occur, and other teams say, oh, no, we're going to stay down the hill and drive up on the morning of the competition and get out of there as quick as we can so that we don't develop any of the side effects, right? We don't get the sickness. So the book mentions that for anaerobic sports in particular, you know, they're not going to have any impact on their performance by being at altitude, but if they get sick or they've got really bad headaches, then obviously their performance would be affected. Football teams do this when they're playing Denver, right? Different football teams will approach how they play it in Denver differently. And we'll look at, we looked at blood doping. Hopefully you watched the video from yesterday. Blood doping is one of those ergogenic aids, and it is based on this idea, right? If I can get more red blood cells in without going and spending 2 months at altitude, because that costs money, then I can do it the cheap way, right? They also use some teams are using oxygen tents now to try to boost naturally the EPO. I haven't heard, like hyperbaric chambers and hypoxic tents are being used. I haven't heard that they've been banned yet, although it would obviously give teams that have more money an advantage over teams that that can't afford that equipment, which doesn't seem quite fair. But a lot of the banning stuff is based on it being dangerous to people, and so they don't want it being modeled as an acceptable behavior. Okay. Okay, so that's all I have on the altitude information. There is, of course, more detail in the chapter, and as I said, given where we live, I think that it's quite an interesting set of information for you guys, so enjoy reading more of the detail. Okay, next environmental challenge is the heat. All right, so what we have to be careful of, the fancy terms, we don't want to see hypothermia. All right, so hypothermia means that not your skin, not like what you can touch, okay, but in your core, that your core temperature goes above the range that is safe, right? So the more your core temperature rises, the more challenge there is for your body to get rid of heat and cool you down, right? So it becomes a negative spiral, right? Because if I can't get rid of the heat, then that heat is going to raise my core temperature even further, right? So only about 25% of the food that we eat gets converted into ATP, right? So heat, you know, when you're cold, it's nice to have food and 20 minutes later feel a bit warmer, right? Because that heat is given off by digesting the food. So thermoregulation, another fancy term, just means I can maintain my internal temperature within this very narrow range at a constant level. Okay, so we're called homeotherms because we have to maintain this constant body temperature, and that allows us to perform in these extreme environments. Very hot, very cold. Right? They have these crazy races across Death Valley, right? Why would anybody sign up for a running race across Death Valley? That's just insane, right? So elevated heat and elevated humidity both increase the challenge because they block the mechanisms for releasing heat that we'll look at in a little while. So our normal core temperature, everybody knows, is 98.6-ish, right? It tends to fluctuate a little bit across the day. It'll start out a bit cooler, and some people's average is 98.5, and some people's is 98.7, right? But on average, 98.6. And so we don't have very much wiggle room, because by the time we reach 105.8, we're in big trouble, right? So there's not a lot of room there, okay? Which is why exercising in the heat can cause some problems. All right, I'm going to skip that. Okay. This is too hard to read on here. So this diagram comes from your textbook, so look at it in the textbook because this is blurry. So this is trying to control body temperature and the thermostat is representing the hypothalamus in the brain, right? And so we have an increase in air temperature that gets picked up by thermal receptors in the skin, and that sends information to the brain, and then the brain responds, so we get these voluntary responses to it being hot outside. We maybe loosen our clothing, or we take a jacket off, or we start wearing shorts instead of pants, right? We look for some shade to stand in if it's really hot, and we like to drink cold drinks, right? So those are all driven by the brain because it's recognizing that the temperature of the air is that much higher, right? So then we might also choose to rest, right? But as this temperature goes up, then we start to get the hypothalamus signal some lethargy, so it's more than rest, right? It's, I really I feel, right? And we'll also stimulate sweating. Okay. Sweating is important because we lose that from, where's my, oh, there it is. When we sweat and that sweat evaporates, as we'll get to in a minute, then that's a way we can lose some heat. It might not feel like you're losing heat when you're sweating because you feel really hot, but if you weren't sweating, you'd be really in trouble, right? So what factors give us our thermoregulatory stress, right? So the ambient temperature, the temperature of the air, the relative humidity, so how much water vapor there is, okay, wind speed, and the heat stress index, right? So the heat stress index combines the temperature and the humidity into another number that can be used to dictate physiological stress. And I think the athletic trainers use a heat stress index to shut down training sometimes, although maybe not here because we have so little humidity, maybe we never get to the dodgy heat stress levels, okay? So, for example, if I'm in Alabama, right, and it's 95 degrees, but it's 95% humidity, then the heat stress index is much higher than if I'm in New Mexico and it's 95 degrees, but the humidity is 20 to 30%, right? So that humidity really changes some of the issues, right? So what are our physiological physiological responses then. So first heart rate will go up and cardiac output will go up. All right, and then the body will start to redirect. Remember when we did the cardiovascular system and we looked at that idea that the central nervous system can shut down certain circuits in the peripheral arteries and direct the blood somewhere else, right? So here, instead of directing it to the muscles, it will direct it to the skin to try to cool the blood and dissipate heat through the skin. And that's why we get flushed and red, right? So, mechanisms for heat loss, right? First one, convection. So air blowing over the surface of the skin or running water if you're swimming or standing in the shower, right? So having fans blowing, or if there's a breeze while it's hot, those can both decrease the risk of death. If you've ever gone into a swimming pool where they train competitive swimmers, the water feels really chilly, right? And they do that deliberately because the cooler the water is, the easier it is for these people who are working out really hard to shift heat from their body to the water, right? Then we've got conduction, actual physical contact between two surfaces, so similar to the swimming idea. Sitting in a cold bath, right? To help with heat stroke, and it's that same high to low idea, right? If I've got lots of heat in my body and very little heat in the water, then the heat moves high to low. That's how I try to think about it, all right? So, because of heat loss through convection and conduction, that's why using water tubs, that's why the athletic trainers, using water tubs is much more effective than moving someone indoors to the air conditioning, and better than ice packs because you can hit a larger surface area, although ice packs are better than nothing, right? Radiation, so that's worse at altitude. Remember, the depth of the atmosphere is less, right? So the UV and UV rays are higher, right? When we're in a very hot environment, we don't use radiation very effectively as a heat loss mechanism. And actually, when it's very, very hot, I can end up gaining heat rather than losing heat, right? So, like this summer when it was 110 degrees every day for like 3 weeks, you've got to be careful being outside because my body temperature is 98.6 and it's 110. That means, right, that heat is moving in the wrong direction, right? And then our favorite, evaporation, right? As the sweat vaporizes, it takes heat with it. But you have to be careful of dehydrating. And again, that's one of those ones where you have to be very careful in different environments, right? So if we're in New Mexico, where the humidity, the water vapor is very low, right? Then sweat evaporates very, very quickly because it goes from high to low, right? There's a very good gradient there for the sweat to evaporate. So that can be a problem for a couple of things. One, you may not even realize you're sweating, so you don't realize necessarily how hot you are, right? And two, it's very easy to get dehydrated because you think you're not sweating, right? So you have to be really careful in New Mexico. Now, in Alabama, right, where the water vapor in the atmosphere is very, very high, we have a different problem. You sweat, and you know you're sweating, but it cannot evaporate because there isn't a gradient, right? The water vapor in the air is so high it can't take any more water. So instead of evaporating, your sweat just runs down your body, and then you can't release heat, and then you can overheat very quickly. Okay? So the problems are very different depending on the humidity level that you're training at. Right? If you look at page 321, there's a box there that's talking about wearing a t-shirt versus bare skin, which is quite an interesting little conversation. So I would recommend that you look at that. Where are we here? Almost two. Okay. Okay, this is just some comparisons of environmental temperature to core temperature and what happens at certain temperatures. So when here's our normal range. This is in degrees Celsius, unfortunately, but here's our normal range. So 98.6 is in here. And then as my core temperature goes up, this is where we start to get heat stroke, brain damage, okay? And as my core temperature goes down, we can become unconscious, we can have arrhythmias of the cardiac muscle, and thermoregulation goes away, and we can die at this end as well. So, you know, that core body temperature is pretty crucial. So how does body composition that we talked about at the beginning of the semester impact being able to exercise in the heat? All right. So the larger the individual is, the more heat they're going to produce. Okay. Particularly if they're carrying a lot of muscle mass, because muscle generates heat by contraction. Right. The surface area of the individual helps, so the bigger the person is, the more surface area they've got, and the easier it is to lose heat through their skin. So for certain football players, as they mention, you know, they have more trouble because they're large, and then they've got to wear all this equipment. And so even though they've got a greater surface area, it's covered up with all this equipment, right? If you're overweight or carrying extra fat mass, then that acts like a blanket, right? An internal blanket, and makes heat loss a lot more difficult. So it's really interesting if you have family or friends who are a little overweight, they find it much harder to deal with hot weather, right? They can't release that heat because the fat kind of gets in the way, right? Because between the bloodstream and the skin is your subcutaneous fat. So the fitter I am, the better off I'm going to be in a hot environment, all right? because remember we said that the fitter we are, the more cardio work we do, the higher our plasma volume, all right? So we actually end up with more blood volume as we get fitter. So if you think about trying to exercise in the heat, your muscles are working like crazy, and so your central nervous system is trying to divert blood flow to your muscles to deliver oxygen. But it's really, really hot, so your central nervous system is trying to divert blood flow to your skin to release heat. So you've got this conflict going on, right? So the more blood I have to split up, the better off I am, right? Okay, so we have heat illness in a similar way that we have altitude illnesses, all right? So the higher the temperatures, the more likely we are to suffer from some of these heat illnesses, all right? So the first level is cramping, and heat cramps aren't always the result of a raise in core body temperature. So you can get them just because you're out in heat. Even though your temperature is okay, you still exhibit cramping, okay? So typically there's going to be some dehydration at play. There may be sodium deficit at play or some other electrolyte imbalances, or it could be, bless you, it could be fatigue of the neuromuscular system. Right? So typically, not always, but typically, it's triggered by intense exercise in the heat. Okay, and if you've ever watched tennis, they have a tournament in Australia after Christmas. So it's in the summer in Australia, it's really hot, and you often see the tennis players have to deal with cramping in that tournament. Also at the US Open, I don't think I've seen people cramping at Wimbledon. I'm not sure it ever gets hot enough at Wimbledon. So it's when you watch someone, right, it's just painful to watch them. They're just in agony when these kinds of cramps occur. They don't always occur during the exercise. Sometimes they can occur after the exercise is finished, as you're starting to rest. Heat cramps are the most common heat illness in the first 3 weeks of two-a-day training for American football in places where it's hot. So the treatment for heat cramps is rest, cooling the muscle down, fluids and electrolytes, range of motion stretching, and gentle massage. And you should be able to alleviate the cramp within an hour, so that that poor person can move again. All right? So a little more problematical is fainting or passing out. It's called syncope. And that can happen when you've been physically active in the heat and then you sit or stand for a while. You can get dizziness, or feel a bit lightheaded, or you may even, as I said, pass out completely. So that happens because of the dilation of the arteries and the veins to get the heat out, right? Then we have this excessive divergence of the bloodstream to the skin, and we get pooling of the blood in the legs, so we decrease venous return to the heart, and then the brain ends up not getting enough blood. It's exacerbated by being dehydrated, shocker, right? Everything's exacerbated by dehydration, okay? So we see a reduction in cardiac output, and so the brain isn't getting enough glucose or oxygen, and we can see some brain damage if you're really unlucky, right? There can be some ischemia to the brain tissue. So generally, if you're acclimatized to the heat, you're less likely to suffer this kind of issue than if you're new to the heat. So it's another one to pay attention to if you're going to be coaching and bringing athletes in from other areas of the country where it isn't so hot. You've got to give them a little bit of time to get used to the heat before you do crazy training sessions with them, okay? Oh my God, heat exhaustion. All right, let's stop there. Let's stop there. And then we'll start with heat exhaustion on Monday. We've got to do heat exhaustion, we've got to do heat stroke, we've got to do adaptations to the heat. Okay. We can do that. There's not a lot on cold stuff, so we might get a chance to start the cold information on Monday. We may not get it all finished. You might have to finish that off on your own, but there's a good PowerPoint to help you with that, so I think we're good. And I would say questions, but there's no one here. I'm talking to myself all day. So, if you watch this, not if, when you watch this, if you have questions, then you can use the discussion board Q&A, all right, to put those questions to me so that I can answer those for you. And yeah, have a great weekend. See you on Monday.